Thanks
Do we
everyone
need
for
to
coming
roll?
back to the DisInformation Chronicle. My guest today is Jan Jekeliek. He's a senior editor at the Epoch Times, and he has a new book out called Kill to Order about the Chinese organ harvesting controversy. Thanks for coming on, Jan.
I'm thrilled to be here with you. And as a former congressional investigator that you are, I'm very curious about your questions.
Okay, well, I had a great time reading your book. What first got you interested in this issue? Because it's something that I've known about, sort of out of the corner of my eye, a little bit. I had this idea that there's something happening. Is it true? Is it not true? I never really knew. And you sort of provide all the details in your book. But what got you interested in this issue originally?
I was deep in working on, some of the worst human rights violations that the Chinese Communist Party was involved in. So I had been hearing rumors that there was some kind of organ thing happening, but these are kind of rumors that you would hear in all sorts of places, these black markets, right, in India or in Latin America, Mexico.
What time period are we talking about when this first started for
So
you?
coming up to 2005, so it's been happening at a very low level actually since the 90s, but it was really in 2000 when the Chinese Communist Party incarcerated some huge number, say 1 million of Falun Gong practitioners that they basically there was this geometric growth of their organ industry. It's been happening at scale since but we only really started hearing about it, or at least I only really started hearing about it around 2005, 2006.
Okay. And so how did you bridge into what were you doing at the time that then you segued into this issue?
I've been working on this underground railroad system that was bringing Chinese prisoners of conscience that had escaped from China through the Golden Triangle, this kind of treacherous area, of drugs and warlords and so forth, into Bangkok, where there was this unusual UN refugee office that they could actually get UN refugee status even though they were from China and basically get to another country, or if they were arrested by the immigration authorities, because it was call it kind of a tolerated but illicit UN refugee office, they could get sent back to China. So we were there trying to make sure that no one ever got sent back to China that had come through the system.
And so what evidence, this is one of the things I think a real sticking point, I'm sure for most readers or of your book or listeners, what is the actual evidence we have that there's Chinese organ harvesting happening? What is the solid evidence we have of this?
So it starts basically in 2006. There were two nearly simultaneous, let's call it whistleblowers. Okay. One was a woman named Annie, whose husband was a surgeon. Annie is a pseudonym, kind of undercover, like in protective custody, let's say, right? But Annie's husband was a surgeon who was started having nightmares. Their relationship was basically about to come apart, and she demanded answers, and he confessed to her that he had removed 2,000 corneas from living people. Okay. So that was this one piece. And so, of course, it sounded fantastical, but some human rights workers, like specifically David Matas and David Kilgore, these were two human rights lawyers from Canada. One was the longest serving MP at one point in Canada, also former Secretary of State. The other one was involved in sort of revealing and bringing to justice some of the last Nazi war criminals that were hiding in Canada. So they got involved in this. Then they found her testimony credible. The other case was a transplant surgeon named Jakob Levy, who was basically a professor of transplant surgery at Tel Aviv University. And obviously was doing these transplants. And he had a patient, this is in 2005, that basically told him, I can't wait anymore. Like, a very bad heart condition. The guy said, I've got a deal set up in China to get it done in 2 weeks and scheduled. At which point Jakob said, that's not possible. Except the guy went and did it, got it done, and came back. And so Jakob knew at this point that there was something horrible happening, because the only way you can schedule a heart transplant is when someone's going to be dead exactly.
Right.
The way that it works over there is they just make someone dead that's compatible. So anyway, these were the beginning pieces of evidence, right? This is what sort of launched the whole body of evidence that was later, by 2020, there was something called the China Tribunal, which was led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who had prosecuted Slobodan Milosevic. He got together a bunch of independent experts and talked to absolutely everybody who had evidence around this, who would talk to him over the course of, I think, the better part of 2 years. This international tribunal based in the UK, and they developed the body of evidence in its entirety. Some of it is, for example, incredibly short wait times. Like, I know of one credible case that was 3 days from the time that someone came in and said, "I've got the cash," to getting a new liver. That's just an anecdote that I could verify.
Right.
There's typical time periods are 1 to 2 weeks for vital organs. In a normal situation, right? You have to basically, someone has to have an accident that's compatible with you.
Well, by normal, you mean like in the West, right?
Basically, in the US, let's say, or the way it should be. Turns
Right.
out that it's not always that way either. But the way it should be, someone that's compatible with you in a variety of ways, size, right, blood type compatibility, tissue compatibility, has to have a horrible accident to the point where we're pretty sure they're never going to come back, right? You can't transplant from a cadaver. Only corneas can you transplant for a cadaver. So someone has to be mostly dead, to use that Princess Bride maxim. Someone has to be mostly dead. And you have an ethics team that decides, is this person really not going to come back? And it's okay ethically to transplant the organs from this person into this recipient. And also all these matches have to have. So sometimes you wait years to try to get it, right? But here, basically, it's just standard to do it in a week or 2 weeks.
Right.
How is that possible, right? And that's just advertised that way in the early years before 2006, before basically it became a thing and there was this public outcry, and then it kind of went underground. But they were literally advertising those kinds of wait times, and we also know that over many, many years, those wait times persisted. Okay, piece of evidence. I could tell you many. I mean, some of them were literal phone calls that researchers did to doctors in Chinese transplant hospitals saying, "Do you have organs?" Some of them were even like, "Do you have Falun Gong organs? I heard that those are very healthy and that they do well in bodies. I'd like one of those." And there were people like, "Yes, come and we'll set it up for you in 2 weeks." And these are phone calls that were verified. Again, the body of evidence is very large.
Right.
And many pieces to it, but that'll give you a bit of a flavor of the type of evidence that exists.
So one of the targets for organ harvesting are members of this thing called Falun Gong. And it was really interesting because it's just something I've heard about. I know that you work for a newspaper that's owned or operated by Falun Gong. I've never quite understood what it is. And in your book, I don't think I really came away with a sort of concrete answer of what it really is. And I think part of the issue is, and you point this out, is that the idea that we have of what it means to have a religion is different in the West than the idea of what religion is in the East, which I thought was very insightful.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain these differences between the way that we perceive what a religion is and what a religion is in the East, and then what is Falun Gong? I came away from it. I was trying to understand. Is this a group of people who just have like, here's our ideas of how to improve the world or how to self-improve?
Yeah.
It's like a glorified yoga meeting or something like that. I
Mm-hmm.
could never really wrap my arms around it.
It's more than that, but let me answer your first question at the beginning that you led with. So why was it the Falun Gong that were targeted in 2000? Okay, in 1999 to 2000, when they started, when they built this whole giant industrial strength industry on the backs of the Falun Gong. Before that, we know it had been happening. We even have surgeons that have admitted to being involved in killing someone for their organs before this time. What happened here is to do this very specific thing that's happening in China, this industrial scale forced organ harvesting. It's a whole different level than your garden variety black market organ deal, organ trade setup. You need to have a state actor. You need to have someone who can push mass propaganda into a system, and you need to have someone who can incarcerate a huge group of people. Right. So the Falun Gong were the perfect, I guess, use case or something like this, where literally they dehumanized them with propaganda, very similar to what the Germans did in the 30s to the Jews. Okay. And then they arrested 1 million. It's unclear. This is a bit of a state secret. There's different estimates, but let's say 1 million people. Okay. Now they're able to blood type, tissue type, organ scan, create a database, right? And if I have that ad for 2 weeks, I'm looking at it, I pay 200 grand, there's someone already matched to me in the system, incarcerated, ready to be killed to order. And that's how you can get the 2-week transplant. Background. I wasn't designed with the thought specifically it's only Falun Gong we want to kill using this method. But it was an incredibly I figured, and I have a theory in the book about who this is, right? I think someone thought to themselves, well, I can enact the requirements basically from the top, from Jiang Zemin, who was the dictator at the time. They want to expand our ability to do transplants, and they also want to get rid of the Falun Gong. I can do a 2-in-1 here, right? And that, if I'm right, according to my theory, in this province where they started doing this and suddenly becoming effective at both eradicating Falun Gong, which was the term, Jiang's sort of unwritten term for it, and also building, mass growth in the organ industry, everybody else had to jump on board, because then the question would be, hey, why aren't you so effective as these guys? So it's built on the backs of the Falun Gong. It grows to about 60 to 90,000 transplants a year. By 2005, it kind of plateaus the scale. So we're talking like this is a mass scale situation. The US last year just broke its record for the number of total transplants, which was about 40,000, just over 40,000. Okay, to give you, to kind of frame it a little bit. So, and the tragedy here also is that no one really did anything. And a lot of even big transplant organizations ran cover for the CCP around this, in my opinion. By 2014, the Chinese regime thought, hey, we have another vulnerable group we can use, the Uyghurs. So they're, in a military-controlled region in the northwest of China. They dehumanized them and they incarcerated, let's say, again, we don't know the exact.
Right, but here's the thing: the Uyghurs, it's understood why you'd go after them. They're a different ethnic group. They're Muslim, so they're differentiated ethnically and religiously from mainstream Chinese. What is it about the Falun Gong that they're targeted? What is Falun Gong and why are they targeted?
Absolutely. There are a lot of ancient, what we could call cultivation practices. Okay, this is a translated term that have existed since time immemorial in China. And the way these things would work, it is a bit like it is a bit like a kind of Chinese yoga, except traditional yoga wasn't just the exercises. There's a mind, body, and spirit component, okay? And instead of the way in the West that we separate the way we do things, we have university, let's say, or school for the mind, sport for the body, and then religion for the soul. This is all in one package. Falun Gong is an ancient system of this nature based on truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. And I'll explain why I'm saying this. In my understanding, what you're trying to do is live the balance of these three principles, okay? And the exercises are kind of a supplemental thing, in fact. What you're really living is these principles. And there were voluminous teachings written by a man named Li Hongzhi, who is called the teacher or the master.
What year are we talking about?
He popularized it publicly. It was sort of taught to, as I understand it, to a few people up until 1992. Remember, these things are typically taught in a lineage. I've just learned it, I'm great at it, and I'll impart my teachings to one or a few people. Then those people may impart their teachings. So it's like really no one would ever know this even existed, right? All these different lineages. But this one in 1992, Li Hongzhi had kind of tweaked it in a way, again, as I understand it, to make it accessible to almost anybody who wanted to. Okay, and here's the really interesting thing. Okay, so some people say, why Falun Gong? So by the end of the 1999, there were 70 to 100 million people practicing it by government estimate, 1 in 13 Chinese. And communist parties, obscenely hierarchical, want totalitarian, want total control. It was bigger than the Communist Party membership. For quite a while, I kind of believed that as just a simple answer, because it is. I mean, there's another answer which I've lately come to believe is a significant part of the reality, which is we know that Jiang Zemin, who was the dictator at the time, was incredibly jealous of Li Hongzhi. Because here you had someone who had, the love of 70 to 100 million people, right? Or deep appreciation, let's say. Okay. And he's a totalitarian dictator. His power comes from the barrel of a gun, as Mao famously said. Right? I never thought, when I was younger, I never thought, world leaders made decisions based on things like this. But my thinking about this has changed substantively. Okay. And I actually think that this was a significant factor.
Narcissism.
But 100%. The third thing, though, I think is the most important. And this took me the better part of, I don't know, 15 or 20 years to this just kind of built itself in my mind. Like I realized it, right? See, Falun Gong is very unusual. It's a very unusual as a system. So Li Hongzhi has written voluminous teachings. I mean, really large amounts of thoughts about how to implement truthfulness, compassion, tolerance. So people that do the practice will be interested in these teachings. Maybe read all of them. There's a main book called Zhuan Falun. That's the book that every practitioner would read, right? Falun Gong practitioner read. So there's a lot of teachings. Right, but there are very few what you would call rules. Rules, I don't even know if there are exact rules, but rules would be something that every Falun Gong practitioner would probably agree on. Okay, here are the rules, and I'll explain to you why I'm saying this, because you'll see it at the end. Number one, you're not allowed to enrich yourself from it in any way. There's no kind of collecting of money. There's no treasury. Okay, there's no membership. Okay, what makes you a Falun Gong? There's no roster. What makes you don't join something, right? What makes practitioners living the teachings.
Okay.
Another rule would be don't change the teachings. Another one is, and this is why I often say it's my understanding, right? Don't represent your view of the teachings as the teachings. Basically, the concept is that as with a lot of, let's say, sacred teachings from the past, people would interpret them in different ways and then tell their interpretation as if they were the teachings, and the teachings actually get watered down by people who don't fully understand the breadth of the topic, if you will, right? So that's my understanding why that would be a rule, right? Another one is, and was really fascinating, is that let's say you're all a really good Falun Gong practitioner, you're living truthfulness, compassion, forbearance really well. I'm just going to copy you, right? I'm just going to do what you do because you do it great. No, I cannot do that. As I understand it, I cannot do that. I have to understand the teachings and find my own path through the teachings. Okay.
Right.
It's not acceptable just to copy someone. That you can admire someone, you can get hints from someone, but you're never just going to sort of wholesale adopt how they're doing it, because you have to figure it out yourself. Okay. And by the way, there's also no worship of Li Hongzhi, right? Which is really interesting, because some people have this kind of need to find someone to do that with. Well, it's living the teachings. The worship isn't a part of this system. Okay. But when I add all this up, okay, and this is it just kind of came to me at one point, maybe 15 years into working on this, or 20, I can't remember exactly. If I were to design a system that was somehow like, every social structure has some sort of social pressures in it. Like, for example, let's say you're going to the gym, you pay money to go to the gym, and the fact that you're paying keeps you going to the gym because you don't want to be wasting your money. A structure that keeps you involved in a system. Okay, I think this is just totally my own theory here, right? But I think the way Li Hongzhi tweaked the system, or when he launched it publicly like this, he minimized those sorts of structures so that everybody, essentially, there's nothing would really keep you in there, or not nothing. There might be some things, but there seems to be a very deliberate effort to keep that out. So basically, your own desire to participate is the main motivating factor always, right? And so it's really interesting. This fosters an unbelievable amount of agency in a society that demands complete allegiance to the Communist Party, and it wants to maintain the supremacy of the Communist Party as its number one position. In a way, right, just by its very nature, people who are practicing Falun Gong became a kind of a threat to the regime, because these are free-thinking people. Remember, the number one principle, right, is truthfulness, right? And
Right.
this is this principle. So, by the way, you also mentioned that how the relationship between Falun Gong and Epoch Times. The founders were Georgia Tech students, and they were students that had come over after the student movement in '89. The students that could get scholarships to American and other universities that were involved got out that way. It just never went back, right? And so these students, basically, some of them were Falun Gong practitioners. They started it as a way to remember, there was this huge dehumanization propaganda campaign happening in 1999 and 2000 to justify to the Chinese population and the world, why is it okay to persecute these people in these horrible ways? This was a website that Georgia Tech students founded, initially in Chinese language only, to just tell the truth of that situation, because there wasn't a lot of it. right? We were founded to counter a large narrative, a large, very, very loud narrative that was false.
So there's one kind of interesting point here, which that you sort of drove this home because I was, again, like you just explained what Falun Gong is, and I'm sure some people are listening and be like, well, where's the threat? You're still trying to understand, like, where's the threat that these people are talking to each other and having this certain ideas? Like, why are these people someone that we need to round up and kill? But there's this really interesting passage, and I'll read this back to you, and it says because this explains why it is. You have to understand that in America, this would not be a threat. We wouldn't care about this at all. But it is a threat in China, specifically. And the only way you can understand is to understand how their system of government is set up. And what you write is the critical point is this: there is no higher power than the party. The party is the higher power. The preservation of everything else, including human life itself, is secondary to the preservation of the party. And this was something I think hard for a lot of people who have not really spent much time dealing with China to understand that their system is so completely different. Their way of thinking, their government, the way their government functions is so different from a Western idea.
I would disagree with you. I think it's precisely the Western idea of communism that makes it this way.
How is that?
Well, so what we see in terms of how China is governed, okay, there's a nuance, and this is something I write about in the book. They've modified the way the Soviet Union functioned, okay, really developed under Lenin. I mean, I think Lenin was the real evil genius behind communism. We could talk about that on another day. But I mean, the central feature of Leninism is the total supremacy of the Communist Party, with everything else being subservient. And this is like a central doctrine of anywhere that communism is implemented. And this also explains why every single communist society has mass atrocities. Mass atrocities are not a function of Chinese traditional governance style. These mass atrocities are a function of this Western import of communism, Marxism. And by the way, the reason I mentioned Lenin, right, is Marx wrote these things. Marx was a nobody. Marx was unknown. His economic theories had been completely discredited until the Bolsheviks took power in the Soviet Union. And under Lenin's sort of, again, evil genius pushed this mass propaganda into the world that were these genius ideas of Marx that led them to realize that this is what's creating this amazing utopia in the Soviet Union, which of course was wildly and completely debunked in the Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, right? So anyway, this is a Western thing that we're looking at that's been imposed on China.
I see. So you also go into the complicity of the West in this organ harvesting. I'll go over some of this right here because this is kind of where well, I guess the first question I guess before we get to this is how much of this is still happening right now? Because it's very unclear from your book. It seems like we've reached an apex at some point in time and then maybe it dropped off, although it's hard to tell that maybe they just stopped reporting it as much. So it's really hard to tell how much was really happening, versus how much is still ongoing. How has this changed over time, and what is the ongoing practice right now?
As you've noted, right, it's very difficult to measure because it's a state secret. That means that you can be killed for revealing any revealing any information around this. To the best of our ability, to the best of our knowledge, and we measure this in different ways. There's one of the pieces of evidence that I include in the book in the chapter that lists out all the evidence is this 2016 in-depth investigative report called A Hospital Built for Murder. This hospital was telling the world that it was doing a very large number of transplants, in some cases beating one of the biggest transplant centers in America at the time. If you actually looked at their growth, at their bed utilization, basically these indirect measures of what you would guess, it looked like there's at least an order of magnitude more transplants actually happening at this hospital. So they're telling us there's a lot of transplants happening. It's been growing, right? It's kind of impressive numbers and stuff like that. But the reality was an order of magnitude more than what they were disclosing.
Okay.
Okay. I'm just giving you an example of how we measure these things. Okay. It's very difficult. And then they said that, well, we've started in 2015. It was funny because they said, we definitely don't use prisoners for organs. Okay. But in 2015, they flipped their script. They said, oh, actually, yes, we did use prisoners all along, but now we
Right.
don't use prisoners anymore. We've
Right.
just started an organ registry, except someone was able to show, what a researcher, this is published in peer-reviewed journal, that it's a perfect quadratic equation, which basically means the data is fake, okay, to make a long story short. So why am I jumping around with this? What we know today is that there's a substantial number of transplants that continue to happen. There's a substantial number of people coming in from doing the so-called transplant tourism. I couldn't tell you the exact number right now. We can only do this looking back, right? But the scale does not appear to have been reduced. And the fact that they added the right, it's not clear that that means that there's not enough Falun Gong. I don't think that's what happened. I think they've added the Uyghurs as an extra source because there's a market for whether, Muslims prefer to get transplants from Muslims, except that Muslims being killed for organs doesn't strike me as being something that would be ethically, Okay, to the best of our knowledge, we're somewhere in that range of 60 to 90,000 a year still to this day.
Mm.
We haven't seen any evidence. We haven't seen, for example, mass shutdowns of transplant hospitals, right? This would be the type of thing that would say, oh, look, they're slowing it down. That would be I would love to know that. Okay. I would love to know that these hospitals are shutting down, but they're not. They're working. They're building hospitals in Xinjiang. There's Ethan Gutman is coming out with a book called The Xinjiang Procedure in a few months, and he's looking at exactly the details. Ethan is one of the heroes of this whole kind of research process over the years. He wrote a book called The Slaughter back in the day, which provided a lot of the evidence base for this. Now he's looking at the Uyghur situation with Uyghurs, and he believes the numbers just in Xinjiang are not quite at that level that I described, but still quite significant. And there's also situations where there's a prison, a transplant hospital, and a large crematorium, all built side by side, at least in one case that he's documented, just to give you a sense, right, of where things have gone. And one final thought, okay? Do you remember the hot mic moment between Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and, well, Kim Jong-un was there, but he wasn't speaking with them. Do you remember this?
No.
So just some of the viewers will remember, okay? It was kind of like my phone was basically ringing off the hook when this happened. The three of them are walking in Tiananmen Square, and Putin says to Xi, or rather Xi says to Putin, when we're 70 these days, we're just a baby. I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, okay? Then Putin says to Xi, through continual organ transplantation, perhaps we can achieve immortality. And then Xi says to Putin, our target is 150 years. And this was when I saw this, right, this light bulb went off in my head. Because they have something that Chinese super elite have something called the 981 project. They love to call projects by numbers, okay? That's their elite longevity project, which has the target of 150-year lifespan. And by the way, Chinese super elites do live unusually long. That's already been well documented for some reason, okay? It had never occurred to me, having worked all these years, okay, on this issue, and it never occurred to me that the instant availability of organs for a Chinese super elite, basically in perpetuity, that was part of this longevity project. But of course, obviously it is. We've even had these kind of anecdotal examples where, and this sounds super weird, right? But there's like a eulogy for a super elite, Chinese member, Politburo member or something, that says, wow, it's amazing how many organ transplants he was able to have for his life, or something like this. Like just kind of weird anecdotal stuff that doesn't really make any sense unless you kind of know this part, right? So I don't think it's just, another reason why I think it's still running full steam ahead is it's not just a $9 billion roughly estimated industry, which is, pretty good money if the people you're using are disposable and you have no caring for human life, especially these dehumanized people. But actually, as a super elite, you have unlimited access to organs forever. And that strikes me as being worth a lot more than $9 billion. And another reason why this thing is hard to stop. But what we can stop, you were talking about the US complicity. That's something we can actually have an impact on. And that will save lives, in my opinion.
So let's get into that US complicity here, because that was the one thing that kind of struck me. We have as you document, hundreds of Chinese organ transplant surgeons have trained in major American institutions. You cite University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Mount Sinai Health System, and most of Chinese organ preservation solutions, instruments, immunosuppressive drugs, and transplant diagnostics come from US or Europe and help to start this whole process going. So the medical institutions in the United States have really helped to push this stuff along. And why have they not? I mean, it's not as if you're figuring out something that they're not either somewhat aware of or have an idea that it's happening. I mean, they're closer to this than you are. Why have they not done anything? These, the American.
I don't have a very good answer. I can tell you some theories I have, okay? I mean, part of it is obviously money. We know that money talks, and there's been a number of books written recently about, this sort of deal that American elites made with China. The term that Chinese use is putting powder on the face of the Chinese regime, who found it convenient to put powder on the face of the Chinese regime because they were making so much money along the way. And of course, whenever money is involved, it's harder for you to see the human rights violations associated with it, right? You're going to want to see more of the things that your handlers are telling you. Look, we're making change. Look, you're supporting the reformers. Right. This is all part of basically something called the United Front, which I have a chapter talking about, which are these kind of influence operation, fooling the barbarians as a kind of a euphemism that's used for all this stuff. But so I do think there's a money element. Major transplantation associations have kind of run cover for this whole thing. Like, you weren't like, how the heck are you getting 2 weak organs at such scale? Any transplant body should be asking this question. Give me a credible answer. They have never provided any credible answer for this. Okay, all
Right.
they do is do slander. So, like, why did most major transplant associations just simply not ask, right? Or not demand a credible answer and just accept platitudes, right? Which is what they did. I don't have a good answer for you other than maybe wishful thinking was part of it, but I think money was a big part of it too. And I don't know how it worked yet. This is something that we need to kind of flesh out.
One of the things you point to is there was a recent New York Times op-ed by prominent cardiologists that advocated for redefining death to increase organ availability. Talk to me a little bit about what that op-ed was about and what you think it did. I mean, you place it right there in the New York Times. I read it at the time too, and I thought, well, this is a little interesting.
I argue that so okay, let's backtrack a little bit, okay? You could summarize the way we view, I don't know if we say public health, but just kind of how we approach medicine in 2 fundamental ways, okay? One is what we call Hippocratic medicine, where as a doctor, it's my relationship with the patient that's sacrosanct. I do everything I can to save that one person and make sure they're not harmed by my interventions. That's the basis of Hippocratic medicine. And the emergent property, the sort of the system, is all these doctors doing that, basically prescribing medicine, suggesting surgical interventions, whatever it is. The other way, and this is something which is sort of more common in this public health, sort of statistics-oriented fields of medicine, is what you would call utilitarian bioethics. Okay? Utilitarian bioethics is sometimes described as the greatest good for the greatest number or the greatest happiness for the greatest numbers. Basically, this is a mentality where you say, well, we have this population and, it's okay because for the greater good, right, to sacrifice a few off the end. Let's say if we have a drug that we want to push through the entire population, there might be a few people that don't make it, but more people will make it. I mean, this would be the sort of how someone who's using utilitarian bioethics will say, we'll save more lives over here by sacrificing a few lives over here because these few people might get these bad side effects that most people won't. Most people will actually be saved. Okay. A way to think about that, I realize, is a bit like what is done on a battleground. Like when you're a medic in an army and there's been mass attrition and you're going into a field and you have to pick up who are you taking home and who are you leaving, because you can't take everybody. You just don't have the resources. So you see in the films, right, the people, they put an X on the forehead for the people that they don't think are going to make it, and they leave them and they take the people they think they can save. That does make sense on the battlefield, but that is not the logic you want to use when doing normal medicine in peacetime, right? It's this Hippocratic medicine that we want. course, because, we know each other through the COVID years, Paul, right?
Right.
So I've been looking at this question of utilitarian bioethics quite a bit, right? Because that's the kind of logic that made, I think, a lot of people that created these best practices or so forth for what we actually did during the pandemic was according to this utilitarian bioethics model. What I realized as I was writing this book was that the ultimate implementation of utilitarian bioethics is communism. Okay. And so remember, Stalin famously said, to make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs. Some people think it's Walter Duranty. There's some debate that said that. There's some debate about that. But the point is clear, right? This is why, again, you get mass atrocities in every communist system, because the party is the survival of the party and the creation of the utopia, right, through the party is the greatest good. And so if we have to lose 10, 100,000, a million, 10 million, 100 million people in pursuit of this utopia and maintaining the supremacy of the party to make that happen, that's not really a problem, is it? The only problem would be is if our mass killing actually endangered the supremacy of the party. So let's make sure that doesn't happen. But otherwise, good to go. That's the logic of utilitarian bioethics taken to an extreme, which is how communism works. That's what I argue.
So we're part of the problem also with, our medical authorities and our hospitals interfacing with the Chinese on this issue is that we're so enmeshed with China right now. And you list a few different issues. One is, we all know about the stuff we buy from Walmart, all the cheap goods that come out of China, the way our economies are so interlinked. I don't know if you listen to this or not, but I started paying more attention to China after COVID came, when I was like, why is China able to dictate so much stuff? I didn't know they've censored people in the NBA. There's a really good article by Richard Gere who talks about the fact, you didn't talk about this in your book, but I'd read about this a couple years ago. He says that because of his activism against China on Tibet, that's why he's never been a major leading star in any big film since that time. They have a complete control over Hollywood. It was really interesting because, the other country that we talk about a lot about for foreign policy is Israel. But there are films that come out of Hollywood that are critical of Israel. There's documentaries that come out that are critical of what's happening in Palestine. But you just don't see this stuff sort of happening at the same degree with China. There's this they're the ones who really have the censorship going on here. And you have this one passage you have in here, and you say that in retrospect, the Chinese Communist Party's approach was simple: get itself embedded in as many critical areas as possible until it becomes almost impossible to pull them out. How embedded are they into our economy, our culture, academia? Not all the academic stuff has come out. Like I'm working on some stories about that, about how embedded they are into our universities. But how embedded are they right now?
Massively. I
Yeah.
mean, it's almost an understatement to say massively. This is the problem. When we think of when we think of intelligence gathering, okay, whether it's corporate or state or whatever, or religious dissidents, okay, the way it works in China is they kind of have this mosaic approach where it's like, you're in their social credit system, where they have a system, right, in communist China, where if you do things that are pro-regime, you think things that are pro-regime, you say things that are pro-regime, you do things that are pro-regime, your social credit system goes up and your ability to get better jobs and just use different elements of the system goes up, right? If you do the opposite, suddenly you can't buy a plane or a train ticket because your social credit score is too low and you're not pro-regime enough, okay? So the way they do their intelligence, right? Of course, they have these like super secret, agents and things like that we think of in the movies. But basically, absolutely everybody that's coming out of China is heavily incentivized to gather intelligence. And again, the regime's perspective, it doesn't matter whether it's corporate or you're working, for example, in the New York governor's office,
Right.
or you're someone that's just sort of hanging out with religious dissidents to see what they're up to. All these pieces of information are assembled. You never know what's going to be interesting. Some will be very obviously interesting. Like, for example, people being caught running drones over U.S. military bases or taking photos of Navy vessels or something like that, right? Of course, that's going to be very valuable and seen very positively. But even little pieces of information, or if you're working in a lab, providing the recipe for something that's a proprietary or whatever, you can imagine, right? So that doesn't mean that every single person is doing it. Okay, it just means that every single person is heavily incentivized to do it, by design of the Chinese Communist Party. Right. They have family back home, which can be leveraged further. Like if someone is in a sensitive place and they're not really someone who likes to cooperate, there's plenty of those people, right? It's not like everybody's all keen to cooperate with a totalitarian regime, even Chinese, right? Obviously. But if you're not, then you get a call, saying, hey, listen, my comrade over here is hanging out with your mom and we wouldn't want anything to happen to her. We need you to step up for the good of the nation right now, right? That kind of stuff. Anyway, this is the situation, and that's in academia, it's in the corporate sector massively, right, in Silicon Valley, that's everywhere. There isn't a very good way to deal with it. It's just because we've been asleep at the wheel for a very long time. We don't want to create, sort of scare against Chinese or something like that, right? It doesn't have to do with the fact that you're Chinese or not. It has to do with the fact that you've got the most nasty regime in the world, massive, doing forced organ harvesting on its own people, that's got a hold on you and can leverage you in different ways. And that's just the reality that every Chinese from China faces. So this is something that we have to deal with as a society in a way that's, in a way that's reasonable and fair to everyone. But it doesn't mean that we allow for this type of a mass intelligence gathering at scale for the benefit of the regime, which, by the way, seeks to subvert America at the very least, if not destroy it.
So what are some actions you think that should be taken in the United States? I'm guessing some obvious ones are that we should stop, the National Institutes of Health, funding research in this area, or are hospitals interfacing with these groups? But what are some other actions you think should be taken? And then second, do you think that we're going to take it? Or do you think it's like, well, hey, this is somewhere far away. I don't see it that often. And my uncle got to fly over and he needed a kidney and he got one. So why am I concerned about this? What do you think? What are some actions?
This to me is kind of a no-brainer, and this is one of the things that excites me. Having looked at this issue for the better part of 20 years, okay? Initially, it was just even hard to talk to people about it because it's so extreme and so macabre what's happening that people just don't want to know. They clue out in the middle of the conversation. I had this happen to me countless of times. Today, and perhaps this is a silver lining of COVID, this is one of my theories, right? People seem to be ready to accept that people do very extreme things to other people. And
Right.
I can have this conversation with almost anybody and they'll hear me out to the end and say, that's horrible. So that's a huge step, right? I remember I told you about that professor of transplant medicine, that was one of the first kind of quote unquote whistleblowers. He enacted a law in 2008 in Israel that basically said, the state socialized medicine is not going to support China transplants, which basically stopped it.
Right.
It took a long time, but since about, I think it's 2021 or 2022 were the first states that started having legislation of this nature for Medicare, Medicaid, insurance. So there's 6 states now that have enacted legislation like that. It took a while, but the U.S. is seeming to get into it. There's 3 pieces of federal legislation, 2 have passed the House near unanimously that deal directly with forced organ harvesting. One is called the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act. Another one is called the Falun Gong Protection Act. That one focuses more on, doesn't just focus on Falun Gong, it focuses on China explicitly, whereas the Stop Forced Organ Harvesting Act kind of a more broad legislation. And there's another block act that also is in committee right now that deals with, it kind of functions a bit like these other ones that prevent people from insurance paying for Medicare and Medicaid paying for a China transplant. So there's a lot of good stuff. All this stuff should be passed. Like, this is a good idea. There's another 44 states that can pass, this kind of legislation as a starting point. But what I really think should be done, right, and I think this can be done both at the administration level and at the congressional level, is basically stop all cooperation of any sort with the Chinese transplant system. I mean,
Right.
it's a real no-brainer. David Matus, who I mentioned before, was this guy who was involved in prosecuting the last Nazi war criminal in Canada. He called it an evil yet to be seen on this planet. That's what it is. It's happening today. It continues, right? So, whether it's NIH or more broadly HHS, this is something you and I could talk about a bit more, offline about how
Right.
best to approach this. But there's no reason for us to be funding anything related to the transplant system in China. Training surgeons, which end up being murderers. because this
Right.
doesn't make any sense to be participating in this at all, or ships. I have to share this with you. This is important, okay? In the American Journal of Transplantation, I believe 2022, there's a paper titled Execution by Organ Procurement. I still can't believe they let them actually have that title. But basically, authors looked at the Chinese transplant literature and found at least 70 violations in the published transplant literature and peer-reviewed, some of them American journals, as I understand it. Okay,
Right.
but um, of violations of the dead donor rule. And what that means is that the people written up in the scientific methods public were killed by their organs being extracted. And the way I read that is just so normalized over there. It's been going on for 25 years now at scale that they just don't even know. They don't notice that this is a problem, that you don't violate the dead donor rule, right? And that's, you want to talk about complicity, right? Now we have two organ systems transplant systems that have been discertified in America. We had this idea, we're going to change them. They're going to become a democracy. This was the narrative, back in the
Right.
day that we were fighting. I
Right.
was like, no, they're killing religious dissidents. They're not liberalizing. No, they've changed us. And now we're writing op-eds saying, hey, let's make the dead donor rule. Maybe we don't need to be that as serious about that as we thought. No, we need to be incredibly serious about that. And we need to cut off these relationships. And this can be done quickly and then codified through something like with the Wolf Amendment. The Wolf Amendment is something that was added to an NDAA once upon a day and actually saved the American space industry. The Wolf Amendment basically said, if you're a company that in any way deals with federal dollars, you cannot cooperate with China on space stuff. I mean,
Right.
that's a very glib summary, okay? But that was brilliant, right? It just prevented all wild amounts of IP from being given directly to the Chinese Communist Party to build its space program. And it's part of the reason why our space programs are so advanced, whether something like this could be the idea could be repurposed here and just say, look, anything that any company in any way is involved with federal dollars cannot be collaborating with China on transplantation, right? I think that would be a wonderful law, and that would help codify things that administration agencies could do themselves. These are my thoughts out of the box. Someone like you will have even better thoughts than I, because this isn't a space that I've kind of worked in a lot, right? And when it comes to crafting legislation or government approaches.
You have any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, I'm very happy we're at a time when finally there's a lot of interest in this issue. My book, by the way, can be found at killtoorder.com. Okay. It's actually a #1 bestseller in communism and socialism as we speak. It's stuck there. Sorry, not #1 bestseller, #1 new release. I think
I
they have
see.
different terminologies. But it's been kind of stuck there for a while now, which is great. With any luck, as we're here, more people. The book is very. I think you told me this yourself, is very readable, and so
Yes.
for people who might not actually kind of want to read an academic treatise on this issue, it's really written for basically anyone who's just kind of interested in knowing some of these realities, and also just the human cost, right, is terrible. I would say my final word is I want to encourage people to get the book. Um,
Buy the book. Buy the
and
book, everyone.
at killtoorder.com. And publisher that Skyhorse taking a chance on this is that it's really the first time where I feel we can meaningfully impact it, right? And maybe this book can play a role in it, but it doesn't matter to me so much. Like, I want to help slow down, at the very least, one of the greatest atrocities of our time. And we can work together on that. That's my final thought. That's the reality.
And on that, let's end. Jan, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks so much, Paul. It's such a pleasure.